Westworld Wednesdays, Episode 1, Season 1. And I believe this is the third part I'm doing for reviewing this episode. I'm going to cut to my intro that I'm using for each of my videos.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're also plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.
So yeah, there's just a few things I want to talk about in this video. Like I said in the first part of this series of videos, I wanted to break up my longer 2-hour review into something that's much more manageable for the average person interested in Westworld. And I think on this first slide, I'm just going to go over the format again. And just in case this is the first time you're clicking on one of these videos, like I mentioned in the first video, I'm talking to various different groups of people. Those who are familiar with Jordan Peterson, those who are only fans of Westworld and don't know anything about Jordan Peterson, those who have seen the series Westworld, and those who have not seen the series. So if you haven't seen the series, I'm doing what I call a Petersonian review. So you might enjoy that. If you have seen the series, I'm doing something that focuses on the psychological and philosophical aspects of the series. And these are things you probably haven't heard from other reviewers. And that's why I'm kind of categorizing it as a Petersonian review. I would love for Jordan Peterson to comment on the series, but I don't think he's going to be doing that anytime soon, considering how busy he is. So anyway, I'm going to conduct this in a way that's spoiler-free in the sense that I will be revealing things episode by episode as far as what happens in the episode. But I won't be revealing anything that happens beyond the episode. And sometimes I will phrase things that you can appreciate if you have seen the entire series, but they will not spoil you if you have not seen the entire series, if that makes any sense. So with that in mind, I'm trying to keep these videos pretty short, and this is probably going to be the last one I do for Episode 1, Season 1. And I will probably edit them all together, these 3 parts, and just leave them up as one whole. And that might work better for some people than trying to click through and find 3 parts. And I think I even have an intro to the whole Westworld series that's also up. That's about 17 or 18 minutes, which I'll also include in that. And then I'll move on to Episode 2 and so forth. I thought I had another slide up, but anyway, this will do. So I want to focus here on the Man in Black again, and you can tell I'm kind of hammering this home. I think he and Ford have been the focus of 2 of the 3, or maybe all 3. I know I did the player piano last part, and I just kind of reviewed the first episode or the first video I did about this to make sure I don't hit on anything in the same way again and again. But I do have to bring up the Man in Black and the Vitruvian Man again. I want to focus on some of these themes. Man being made. So you're going to see in the intro an actual host being dipped into like this liquid white stuff, and it's the construction, and he's sort of held up like a Vitruvian Man, which I went over I think in that part 1 of the series. And so you're going to see that man being made, the hosts being made. You're going to see one particular man being made. I believe that is you're going to see the Man in Black being made, essentially, as far as his psychological development. That's how I mean that. And that carries through as far as I can tell, because we're all the way through Season 2. But it starts, of course, in Episode 1, Season 1. Man being remade over and over again. This is what you see with the hosts when they get injured or shot or cut or whatever happens to them in this park of horrors. they get remade, and their minds also their software gets updated and remade as well. You see part of the hosts getting updated, and the reveries appear to be a bug at first, and then they're known to be more like a feature of the programming instead of a bug. And by the end of this first episode, which is called The Original, Dolores is said to be like new. I believe it's the security officer who says that. He says she's been repaired so many times that she has all like new parts, basically. So even though she's the original host of the park, she is like a new host. That's significant because in one sense, she has gone through so much trauma that every like piece of her has had to have been replaced. And this is part of the great thing I think the series shows as far as an awakening to consciousness happens through trauma, through suffering. And I think this ties very nicely into Jordan Peterson's psychology, and the importance of, and the sort of basic role that suffering plays in the human psyche and in our world. And I think the show really highlights it very well and gives it sort of like a baseline as far as the host's life. Their life is basically suffering, and it's from that they start to emerge into consciousness. And that, again, that's just part of the picture, but I think it's a really interesting part of the picture. So I think last episode, or was it the first part that I did, I mentioned how the episode could also be called Awake, O Sleeper. Because, you know, they have like a code phrase that they say to the host that sort of shuts them down for them to go into a deep and dreamless sleep. And I think I covered that in another episodes or the video, so I'm not going to cover it here. But what I wanted to say here was to also bring up another biblical passage from Revelations 21, verse 5. Behold, I make all things new. And I guess that's also a reference to Isaiah somewhere. But so when he says that, you know, Dolores is like new again, I'm thinking about this, I make all things new. And who is making all things new? It's this creator of the park. He hires all of these people this company hires all these people to work on these robots, these hosts, and give them new parts, give them new minds, you know, to make them new again. And I think we're going to see the ultimate update, the ultimate making new again, coming soon in the series. And how does that also apply to the Man in Black, to make him new again? That's something to think about as you watch the series. This is a picture of the Mesa, and I don't think I touched on this before, but this kind of reminds me, they have this big holographic projection in the Mesa of the park, and all of these important people seem to like monitor what the mortals do down on the earth. It reminds me of the gods looking down onto earth, the Greek gods, let's say, looking at men as like game pieces on a chessboard or something like that. I might have mentioned that before, but it's worth mentioning again. And also the Mesa is in this high point of the park. It's in a mountain. That's where the gods, you know, typically were. They were up high. And in this case, they're up high, but they're also within. They're deep within the mountain, which I think is interesting. Now, I have here Ford's mistake. I don't think I mentioned this before, but he does have an interesting conversation with Bernard about mistakes, and Bernard didn't want to mention a mistake, but Ford says that there's, you know, nature has used trillions upon trillions of mistakes to create humanity, and, you know, the cost of every mistake was always death. So, you know, you making a mistake in programming or me making a mistake in programming is not really that bad. It's not going to be costing lives. Wink and a nod right there. So is Ford's programming of the Reveries a mistake? Is he mistaken in his goals? if it's not a mistake, if the reveries were something intentional, to what end? And is he mistaken in pursuing those ends? These are something to think about as you watch the series, or to reflect upon if you've already watched the series. Is he replacing nature and God by constructing? It's no longer evolution that's taking place. It's him. He's creating the next creature, the next conscious being. Is he making up for past mistakes? That's also something interesting to consider as more about him is revealed and more about the park is revealed. Now, I think this is the last prepared slide I have, yeah. And I'm going to just quote from the book, The Origins and History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann. Again, Jordan Peterson refers his listeners to this book, and it's a very interesting book written by a student of Jung. And the part I'm going to go over is just a couple of pages about the development of ego consciousness and how that eventually becomes the Christ soul in every Christian. So it's like I think I find it very fascinating. So, and I think it's very applicable to the show. So I'll go back to this. Is an interesting. I like the look of this eyeball on the screen. Okay, so as I'll quote now from the book. It's page 125. The creation myth, the separation of world parents. As we have already pointed out, it is consistent with the conscious-unconscious structure of the opposites that the unconscious should be regarded as predominantly feminine and consciousness as predominantly masculine. Just as an aside, you'll recall that Jordan has recently gotten in trouble, so-called in trouble, by saying certain things are mythologically feminine and masculine and so forth. Well, this is bringing sort of the same thing up. And this book, in like 400 or 500 pages, sort of explains that in detail. This correlation is self-evident because the unconscious, alike in its capacity to bring to birth and to destroy through absorption, has feminine affinities. The feminine is conceived mythologically under the aspect of this archetype. Ouroboros and Great Mother are both feminine dominants, and all the psychic constellations over which they rule are under the dominance of the unconscious. Conversely, its opposite, the system of ego consciousness, is masculine. With it are associated the qualities of volition, decision, and activity, as contrasted with the determinism and blind drives of the preconscious, egoless state. The development of ego consciousness, as we have sketched it, consisted in its gradual emancipation from the overpowering embrace of the unconscious, which was exerted to the full by the Ouroboros and to a lesser degree by the Great Mother. Observing the process more closely, we found that its central features were the growing independence of masculinity, originally present only in the germ, and the systematization of ego consciousness, of which in the early history of mankind, as in early infancy, only the smallest beginnings could be detected. The stage of separation of the world parents, which initiates the independence of the ego consciousness by giving rise to the principle of opposites, is therefore also the stage of increasing masculinity. Ego consciousness stands in manly opposition to the feminine unconscious. This strengthening of consciousness is borne out by the laying down of taboos and of moral attitudes, which delimit the conscious from the unconscious by substituting knowing action for unwitting impulse. The meaning of ritual, irrespective of the useful effects which primitive man expects from it, lies precisely in strengthening the conscious system. The magical forms by means of which archaic man comes to terms with his surroundings are, all other considerations apart, anthropocentric systems of world domination. In his rituals he makes himself the responsible center of the cosmos. On him depends the rising of the sun, the fertility of crops, and all the doings of the gods. These projections, and the various procedures by which the great individuals distinguish themselves from the herd as chiefs, medicine men, or divine kings, and the demons, spirits, and gods, are crystallized out from a welter of indeterminate powers, we know to be expressions of a centering process that imposes order upon the chaos of unconscious events and leads to the possibility of conscious action. Although nature and the unconscious are ordinarily experienced by primitive man as a field of unseen forces which leave no room for chance, life remains chaotic for the germinal ego, dark and impenetrable, so long as no orientation is possible with regard to these forces. But orientation comes through ritual, through the subjugation of the world by magic, which imposes world order. Even though this order is different from the kind we impose, the connection between our conscious order and the magical order of early man can be proved at all points. The important thing is that consciousness as the acting center precedes consciousness as the cognitive center, in the same way as ritual precedes myth, or magic ceremonial and ethical action precede the scientific view of the world and an anthropological knowledge. Now, as another aside, if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, that's exactly what he's always been saying, is that we act first. We dramatize what we know before we actually know what we know. So if you want to hear that again, I'll just read that sentence again. The important thing is that consciousness as the acting center precedes consciousness as the cognitive center, in the same way as ritual precedes myth, or magic ceremonial and ethical action precede the scientific view of the world and anthropological knowledge. The center common to conscious action through the will and to conscious knowledge through cognition is, however, the ego. From being acted upon by external forces, it develops slowly into the agent, just as it ascends from the state of being overpowered by revealed knowledge into the light of conscious knowledge. Once again, this process is first accomplished not in the collective parts of the group, but only in the great, i.e. differentiated individuals, who are the representative bearers of the group's consciousness. They are the institutional forerunners and leaders whom the group follows. The ritual marriage between fructifier and earth goddess, between king and queen, becomes the model for all marriages between members of the collective. The immortal soul of the divine king Osiris becomes the immortal soul of each and every Egyptian, even as Christ the Savior becomes the Christ soul of every Christian, the self within us. In the same way, the function of the chief, which is to will and to decide, becomes the model for all subsequent acts of free will in the ego of the individual. And the law-making function, originally attributed to God and later to the mana personality, has in modern man become his inner court of conscience. We shall be discussing this process of introjection later, but for the moment we shall formulate the masculinization of consciousness and its theoretic importance thus. Through the masculinization and emancipation of ego consciousness, the ego becomes the hero. The story of the hero, as set forth in the myths, is the story of this self-emancipation of the ego, struggling to free itself from the power of the unconscious and to hold its own against overwhelming odds. So there's a lot there, and hopefully if you're thinking about Westworld as I read that, as you probably are since you're watching a Westworld review, if you've already seen the series, you can put some pieces together. And if you haven't, what I would say is that there's a couple of different things happening here. Like I said previously, you're watching what you're really watching, or one of the things that's interesting that you're watching in the series, is the creation of, as I put it earlier, a man, but also his consciousness. And you're also seeing, one of the things you're seeing is the creation of a god and the falling of a god, the dying god and the ascending god. You're seeing a principle of rules and taboos being established, and you're also seeing it collapse. And as things collapse, a new consciousness rises from the unconscious. And you're going to see this in a male form in the Man in Black, and you're going to see it in a female form with Dolores. So it's a lot to keep in mind if you're new to the series and watching it. But I think the series does a wonderful job over the first 10 episodes of sort of just laying it out layer by layer and little by little over the course of 10 or 11 hours or so. So I think that's where I'm going to end this review today. And like I said, I'll probably stitch everything together for episode 1 so that people can find it in one video. And then next week I'll move on to episode 2. So if you like these kind of psychological/philosophical reviews of Westworld, and you're interested in these primary sources that I'm quoting, and Jordan Peterson and so forth, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you.